Hello, and welcome to the Current and Future State of Interoperability, a panel discussion with industry thought leaders. I'm Carol Flagg of Answers Media Network. Thanks for joining us today. On today's event, our moderator and panelists will discuss both the challenges and the opportunities interoperability now presents and offer their thoughts on what the next few years will look like. This event is hosted by Answers Media Network. You can learn more about us at any of our network sites. You can also listen to our internet radio station offering programming 24/7 at healthcarenowradio.airtime.pro. Our sponsor for this event is Orion Health. Founded in 1993, Orion Health is an award-winning global provider of healthcare information technology advancing population health and precision medicine solutions personalized care across the entire health community. Visit Orion Health at www.orionhealth.com. This event is a webcast. Our moderator and panelists will be on their webcams the entire time. We plan to go at least 55 minutes for our conversation, leaving a few minutes for Q&A. Post-event, you will be able to find the video recording on YouTube, as well as in our Learning Hour lunch on our radio station. We will email you links to find both the video version and podcast version of today's event. On our agenda today for discussion are the following topics: the need for collaboration and sharing, MACRA, MIPS, and bundled payments, are they the financial drivers for interoperability, the impact of the 21st Century Cures Act, competing models, regulatory approaches versus market-based approaches, and social determinants for healthcare. And now I will introduce our moderator and our panelists. Our moderator is David Harlow. David is a healthcare lawyer and consultant with over 25 years of public and private sector experience. He is no stranger to us as he also serves as host of our Answers Media Network HIPAA Chat. He is a healthcare generalist working with healthcare providers, vendors, and payers of all shapes and sizes that rely on him to help them navigate the maze of regulatory and business issues facing them on a daily basis. You can read his award-winning blog at healthblog, that's blawg.com. Our all-star lineup of panelists here to discuss interoperability include Michael Matthews, President and Chair of the Board of the Sequoia Project and the Senior Engagement Director for the Cedar Bridge Group. Michael is a longtime champion for health IT, and much of his work has been in the health information exchange area, and he's achieved such industry milestones as being the first HIE to participate on eHealth Exchange and the first to interoperate with the VA, Department of Defense, and SSA health record systems. His accomplishments have been widely recognized by his peers, including being named as one of the 26 smartest people in health IT and eHealth Advocate of the Year. Also joining the panel today is Dr. Mark Frizzi, Vice Chair of Business Development, the Department of Biomedical Informatics at Vanderbilt University. Mark is the Accenture Professor of Biomedical Informatics in the School of Medicine at Vanderbilt University, where his work focuses on the intersection between healthcare informatics, economics, policy, and healthcare transformation. He also led the development and oversight of a 6-year federal and state-sponsored effort to create and operate a health information exchange in Tennessee for the greater Memphis area. This exchange currently has over 7 million records covering the care of 1.2 million individuals and is now managed completely by a Memphis-based board and a commercial vendor. And finally, I'd like to introduce Dave Bennett, the Executive Vice President, Product and Strategy for Orion Health. Dave has been a technology entrepreneur for over 20 years, joining Orion Health in 2013. Prior to Orion Health, Dave served as a Senior Vice President of Integration at Nant Health, a healthcare information technology company, assisting with the formation of Nant Health and new predictive models of care. Dave has over 2 decades of experience in developing and leading successful information technology firms. And now, David, I'm going to turn the panel discussion over to you, and we'll rejoin you at the end for a Q&A.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you. And welcome, gentlemen, and welcome all to today's discussion of interoperability. We're going to delve into this along a number of different parameters, as Carol outlined, from a regulatory perspective, from a technology perspective, from a public policy perspective, from a practical nuts and bolts perspective at the individual provider level. So to start off this conversation, I'm going to pose the question to the panel: on the need for collaboration. We all talk about collaboration. We all talk about interoperability. There's been a gap to date between the talk and the action on the ground as far as true interoperability may go. So we may need to talk a little bit about defining terms. When we say interoperability, what do we really mean? And more important than that, I'd like each of the panelists to articulate the way in which we need collaboration to work and the way in which health IT can empower collaboration for the benefit of the healthcare system and for its stakeholders. To kick this off, I'm going to ask Michael to start.
Well, thanks, David, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on what part of the country you're in. It's really nice to be on this panel with my esteemed colleagues. I would start off with the question that if sharing of data is such a good idea, why has it been so darn hard over the years? You know, a lot of people have been putting a lot of effort in the last 10 or 15 years towards having ubiquitous data exchange and interoperability. Yet here we are in 2017, still with a lot of work to go. A very good friend of mine, Sir Winston Churchill, once had a quote that said, you know, we're not at the end of data sharing. We're not at the beginning of the end, but perhaps we're at the end of the beginning. And I think that's maybe a perspective that we take here. That good hard work has resulted in a lot of accomplishments. We've got a lot of infrastructure laid. There are trust agreements. The number of actors involved in interoperability has certainly expanded rapidly. But yet we still know that the glass is not always half full, that we have some challenges left to go. And through the conversation today, I'm sure we'll be unpacking some of the remaining work to be done. And what makes it such a challenge, I believe, in interoperability, that there's not just a technical barrier or a technical challenge that we need to face, even though there are some of those remaining. There are legal and policy considerations, there are organizational considerations, financial and business drivers. So all of that will come together. And the last introductory comment I think I would make is that I believe all of the panelists and many in the audience would agree that health IT and interoperability are not an end unto themselves. They're a means to an end. But look at how dramatically the end has shifted over the course of the work that we've been doing in this space for the past 10 or 15 years. You know, as we move toward value-based care and population health and go into the brave new world of genomics and precision medicine, you know, our work to challenge ourselves about how to share data remains constant, but yet the environment and context within which that data are shared, that is constantly changing, forcing us to stay on our toes to make sure that we're relevant with all the business and financial and environmental drivers. And that's the only way we're going to ultimately achieve meaning to each of the people on the in the audience today. So,
thank you, Michael. Mark, I wonder if you could pick up where Michael left off and talk about sort of what are the needs at an institutional level that you see from your vantage point in terms of collaboration and information sharing?
Well, I think I'd start by saying that we all look in the mirror and we know we need more collaboration. I think every institution, no matter how large, understands that today it's more of a node on a network than it is a freestanding entity. No large hospital or clinic is the center of the universe anymore. In fact, the more you look at it, the more you realize with the economic pressures and everything else, we've got to, dare I use a time-worn phrase, center this thing around the patient. And in order to play our role, whatever our role is, in the improvement of healthcare, we've got to have a coherent view and share one set of information, one plan. So why isn't this happening? Well, I'll just go back to my friend Winston Churchill's favorite quote, and that is, Americans always do the right thing after they've exhausted every other possibility. And Lord knows we've tried just about everything in this. But we're kind of like a circular firing squad here. And it's all behavior when you think about it. The first thing is that we inherently distrust change very, very much. The second thing is when there's a long-term change that's essential, But at the same time, ironically, because of the federal legislation and the like, we are so preoccupied with immediate threats that it's very hard to stand up and look down the road about what's coming down when you're basically being slammed every day just to make your margins at all. So the trick to me is to figure out how to solve your immediate needs in a way that preps you up, if you will, for the long-term challenges.
Right, right. Well, I think we'll get back to the circular firing squad and think about how we're faced with a bunch of challenges that may be described aptly in that manner. But Dave, to kick things off, when we talk about sharing of information, what do you see as the driver for that need? I mean, I think we've all sort of leapt right in. We take as a given that more information sharing is better. What, you know, for the doubters among us, why is that so, and what can we do to collaborate better?
Yeah, it's an interesting time in healthcare in general. I mean, you see these markets shift like this, where you get so many kind of pressures on a system all at the same time. We haven't seen this really probably in 20 years, but we have shifts from, if you look at, and I'm going to go all over the place a little bit here, but if you look at the pipeline for drugs, the pipelines for drugs are heavily emphasized around orphan and specialty drugs. And if you think about what that's going to do to our healthcare system, it's going to shift our standards of care. They're going to get much more precise based on these orphan and specialty drugs because the gold standard of care is no longer the same. So the kinds of information you'll share is very different than we've ever seen. We're also going to see more consumers involved because there's going to be more transparency on cost. And as consumers are involved, I think it's going to force some collaboration among us. If we don't collaborate, we're going to probably be out of the loop. You know, you can see what Amazon has done to the market in general, and when you find an organization that figures out how to deal with consumerization and solve some of those problems by sharing data across the ecosystem, you're going to see those organizations become the heroes in the future. And then you have, you know, the shifts in incentives. You know, the incentive shifts are driving probably the biggest change in interoperability we've ever seen. You know, if I started a company many years ago, and we sold to every industry, and they had real business drivers for being interoperable. We as an industry, you know, make excuses about standards and all this stuff. Look, standards are always going to evolve. There's always going to be new ways to connect either a document, a message, or an API, and those are really non-issues, I think. I think we use them as excuses, and I blame both providers and physicians and payers of using them as excuses. Reality is we have to start having real business cases that force us to interoperate and force us to collaborate. And I think we're finally getting at that point where consumerization, precise medicine, new types of incentive models are going to change the requirement for interoperability of data across the entire continuum. And it's going to be very patient-centered, I believe, like Mark said.
So would you say, Dave, that was the meaningful use experiment a necessary evil to kickstart the industry in the right direction, or do you think we could have skipped that? Not sure what you're saying. Which side of the aisle you come down on there?
So I think it was a good thing to kickstart it, but I think we could have worked on the business model first. I think if we worked on the incentive model first, then it would have drove the right technologies. I think we went down a billing system approach versus a approach to the continuum of care and the patient-centric approach. I think it kind of got muddled through that whole meaningful use process, to be honest with you. And it's unfortunate because the amount of money taken out of the system for true innovation is pretty frightening when you look at some of the hospitals and providers today, the margins they have. I would say at the same time, the healthcare system is in a unique opportunity to leverage technology that other industries are leveraging today and leapfrog some of those legacy industries. But it's only, the way it's going to work is there's going to be a few heroes that figure this out. Maybe it's Vanderbilt. Maybe it's from some other organization. They're going to figure this out. They're going to solve the consumerization. They're going to solve the collaboration. They're going to solve the precise health problem and the incentive problem, and you'll see them become dominant. And I think you're going to see that happen all over the country.
Yeah. So along the lines of talking about sort of what are some of the other regulatory drivers here where we've sort of gotten to the end of the road with meaningful use, and it's sort of transmuted into the MACRA and MIPS collection of regulations, which are going to be having an effect on providers' bottom lines next year, if I'm not mistaken. Health information technology incentives, quality payment programs, and in tandem with that, there is the 21st Century Cures Act and its approach to interoperability, which frankly I think many folks thought was baked into meaningful use from the get-go, but turns out not to have been. And just as an aside, and I will share information with everyone on this call later, there was an announcement yesterday, I believe, from ONC about its efforts to kick off the conversation on interoperability under the 21st Century Cures Act. It will have its initial meeting on July 24th, and there will be a combination of live and virtual listening sessions over the next couple of months or so, and the agency plans to get some draft rules out there by the end of this year. We'll see if that happens on schedule. But again, there'll be an opportunity for folks to weigh in with thoughts through this listening session model as we develop the interoperability and usability standards, whether it's for APIs or other things. Gentlemen, any of you have a wish list for that interoperability set of standards, whether it's on the API front or otherwise?
Well, I'll pick up on a few things that you had in your comments there, David. You know, at our core, we have to have greater incentives to share data than incentives not to share data. I think that's what we've been wrestling with over the years. You know, there's a lot of conversation remaining about data blocking. I would put data blocking as commission and data blocking as omission. You know, the overt blocking by commission, I think, is fairly limited in this country. But you know, there's still a lot of inertia around the sharing of information. You look at, you know, what are the incentives not to share information? Well, one of them is just it takes effort. I think Mark said, you know, we're resistant to change. And one of the, I think, shortcomings of the MU funding, particularly on the ambulatory side, is the clinical processes were not redesigned when the technology went in. It was just putting technology on top of oftentimes broken processes, which froze those in place, and now we're asking those broken processes frozen by technology to now embrace interoperability into the workflow. And so that's a lot to overcome. The cost, the competitive forces that are still out there, and I think there remains fear around the loss of revenue if I take the time and effort and cost to look up was there an MRI or lab test done. Well, that's revenue out of my pocket. So what's on the other side of that to drive incentives towards sharing? Well, you know, we have quality measures. We have to demonstrate better gains in efficiency through the use of data sharing. And there's a lot of promise around value-based care, but you know, in this pluralistic society of mixed payment models of fee-for-service, of fee-for-value, and that sort of thing, we may just now be getting to the tipping point where those incentives are becoming more powerful, that it's worth the time and effort to do some of that process redesign. And the final thing I'll just say during this segment is I want to come back to Dave Bennett's comment around standard of care. You know, the one thing that seems to be missing in the interoperability conversation is data sharing a standard of care. If it is, then we're obligated as professionals in this business to figure out efficient and effective ways of doing that. If it's not a standard of care, then I got to question, why are we spending all of this time doing it? Now, I'm passionate that it is a standard of care, but you know, as most standards of care go, once the data are compelling and there are mechanisms to do it, we've figured out ways of knocking down the barriers to make sure that that standard of care is in place for everyone. We're still lacking that on data sharing.
Thanks, Michael. Anyone willing to take, even as a, just for the sake of argument, the counterpoint? Is data sharing not a standard of care?
I would say that the problem is that data sharing means so many things. Standards of care means so many things. All of these words just basically can mean whatever you want. So it's very easy to walk out of meetings, as some of us have done now for decades, over interoperability and think that everybody's agreeing on things, and really they have a completely different view of what they're talking about.
Right.
And there's several flaws to that, and I learned a lot of these from a mentor of mine, former Governor Phil Bredesen of Tennessee, who at his address in 2007 made a couple points. He said, bill version 1.0 first. Don't bill version 6.0 first. I've rarely seen a standards body do that. Second thing he said was, do one thing well to show people you can do something. And again, one of the tragedies of the love-hate I have with meaningful use is they try to do everything, boil the ocean. Okay, and do one thing well. And the final things, focus on the meaningful average customer. And we have failed in a lot of those things quite often. And we go into a regulatory hysteria worrying about every little nuts and bolts thing while we fail after year after year after year of effort and a lot of money to just show people basic things. So to me, I'm an former academic internist and pretty high-powered guy. To me, evidence-based care means, for goodness sakes, when some little older person gets discharged from the hospital, will somebody please see that they're taking the right meds 2 days later? I mean, that's evidence to me. If you've got a lab test, can I please see what it is? We're not talking about rocket science here. We're talking about blocking and tackling on the fundamentals. And again, my notion is the game has changed. Meaningful use was a top-down stimulus designed largely by people who thought information technology and healthcare IT was CPOE and EHRs. It's not. It's data. It's market forces. It's drive. And we're moving that way now. And we have got to be thinking about how we're going to address those needs by having some simple, straightforward, quick wins that show the economic and social value of greater collaboration.
Yeah. David, can I quick follow-up question for Mark? Mark, how would you react to a statement that says the standard of care could be judged in a court of law, that if there is a bad patient outcome and that someone could demonstrate that there was clinical data available to the clinician that would better inform the diagnosis and treatment decision, it was a click away through some kind of portal or icon on the EHR, and the time was not taken to access that available and meaningful information that would have changed the course of treatment and changed the outcome of the patient, and the clinician would then be held liable. Do you believe that that would meet a definition of standard of care? Where would you see that as a driver in the future?
No, I would view that as an aberration of standard of care, an endpoint, if you will, that's inevitable. I don't care how much you have, how much you do. There's always an edge case where something else, you could find something, what if, what if, what if. You judge care by the quality of the decision with the information at hand. But that has been a blockade. E-prescribing, the RX fill message, was something a lot of people were worried about because it felt they had an obligation. Again, it gets down to the version 1.0. I think a lot of providers are terrified that if there's something out there somewhere and they don't get it, they need to do it to provide care. So hence, I must get everything. Then I get everything and I can't find anything. So I think it's a legitimate thing, but I think it's just another excuse like privacy to stop incremental progress.
Thanks.
Yeah, to follow on what you were saying, Mark, I think that there's a great concern on the part of many clinicians when a patient, an engaged patient says, I want to send you all of my home readings or all of the information from my Apple Watch or my Fitbit or whatever. And the physician says, no, don't send me all that stuff. The question, of course, is can we filter that and provide information in a meaningful lowercase m way? And I think the answer to that is yes. And there are tools available and interfaces available in order to be able to do that, to the great benefit of patients and to the great advancement of value-based care, where we defer in-office visits in favor of telephone consultations based on data that can come in. but yes, there's certainly liability. There's certainly cases have been brought based on what's in the EMR, what's not in the EMR, what did the physician read, what did the physician do, and there's case history there. Malpractice cases are being brought where the EMR is front and center.
I agree.
Yeah.
I have great confidence in the legal establishment here to continue to find things like that, no matter what we do.
Mm-hmm.
The fascinating thing is I have a son with a genetic disease, and he actually is on a drug specifically for his variation. And my doctor actually didn't have that variation in his system. I had to tell him about it. So you could look at it the same way. It was a piece of paper that said what his variation was, and it wasn't in his system. He really didn't have the tools, so you could blame the EMR for not having the tools, or you can blame the doctor for not using the resources. Reality, there's no way in 10 minutes, he has cystic fibrosis, but this doctor can look through reams of paper and understand all the variations and all the therapies specifically for that. He needs tools. There's just no way around this in the future. They need some kind of tool to help them say, here's some data that you might be interested in that you want to share with your patient at some level.
Right.
So
So
I'm claiming
where are we in terms of developing those tools? I mean, we're here to talk about interoperability, and at one level, interoperability is kind of a 1.0 kind of issue. The question is, once all of the information is integrated about a particular patient or about a particular episode, then what do? We have a tremendous amount of information. If it's a couple of MRI scans and a bunch of home monitoring information, it's not something that can be viewed easily by a human. We're going to rely on screening of that information by intelligent systems, artificial intelligence, machine learning programs, etc., whatever the buzzword of the day is to describe those systems. I'll start with you, Dave. Are we there yet in terms of being able to look at these vast amounts of data that we hope to pull together through the magic of interoperability?
Well, it's interesting. The vast amount of data, you should probably qualify that, because there are some organizations, we have some of our customers that have 15 years of clinical data from primary care to secondary to inpatient, have all that data. But some are pretty thin today, so the mass amount of data varies. Sometimes it's in one context, and if it's only in one context, it doesn't help you with the problem to really do good machine learning. But yes, we're starting to see the early phases of that. We have projects. There's a lot of great companies out there doing projects where they're actually looking at this data and looking to find patterns to help you with readmission management, to help you find high-risk patients quicker, to help you deal with better outcomes because of social behavioral issues that you're assessing through a process, looking at genomic information and maybe using targeted sequences to determine, hey, before I put this person on this drug, I want to actually understand what drugs can this person metabolize. So there's a lot of things going on where I think we can help our clinicians do a better job, help our patients, because I think this is a two-way street too. I think that same information needs to be dumbed down at some level, but needs to be shared with the patient. So the patient can have a joint discussion with a clinician to say, hey, I don't understand this, but what does this mean? I can't take this drug because I metabolize it different. Those kind of conversations. And Mark will probably tell you our clinicians aren't ready for that today, but that's where we have to go. We have to give them tools, information, and leverage data to drive better care for these patients and be very patient-centric, I believe. And so to me, sharing of information and collaborating information is absolutely key, and it has to be the continuum. And it eventually has to get into social behavioral and biometrics like you talked about. I don't know about the consumer-based ones because the reliability of those, but definitely the professional, Class 2 certified ones, and eventually even orphan and specialty drugs, because that'll drive very different standards of care, I believe.
If I can pick up on Dave's comment as well, I think the key thing that stood out to me was his use of the term tools, plural. That, back in the day when Mark and I would go to some of the meetings in D.C. and we'd sit in a dark room all day, it's like a self-help or therapy support group or something.
Yep.
Or souls who are dedicating their professions to figuring out ways of interoperability, and it was almost like the quest for the Holy Grail, where we were trying to define what is the approach to data sharing, not an approach or a whole toolbox full of approaches that work for different use cases. And I think one of the things that's has made a lot of progress over the last 2 or 3 years, I would say especially, is recognizing there is no one approach that's going to solve all of our interoperability and data sharing challenges. I think we have seen a lot of value in a lot of different use cases, so I'm going to wax over toward the glass half full for just a moment. We've seen the eHealth exchange and the power of eHealth exchange in connecting to the federal agencies like the VA and Department of Defense and Social Security Administration. We've got rolled out through Sequoia with Care Equality, which has an opportunity to scale very dramatically. Commonwealth has really a big footprint and getting bigger. Folks like Direct Trust, even secure text messaging. The point of all of that is that all of these use cases have need for data sharing and possibly different tools to enable that data sharing. But to say that it's a zero-sum game, well, if we embrace this tool, we can't embrace these other tools. Again, I think we're sub-optimizing how all of those tools can come together in a meaningful way for a clinician who's out there having to engage with patients in a variety of different ways.
So having said that, Michael, is it a fool's errand to try to establish standards for interoperability through a federal rulemaking process?
Well, I'll give a quick comment, and I'm sure my colleagues...
Not to put you on the spot.
have their own. I think the standards and regulatory approaches have their place in this world. There are a couple of challenges here overall. I keep using the word challenges, but there are a lot of challenges. Oftentimes we work on the supply side of interoperability, laying the foundation for interoperability, the tools I just mentioned and so forth. I think what's missing is the demand side. What can we do to encourage clinicians to take the time to be able to seek the data that's available on their particular patients? So regulatory to me and standard setting and so forth has a place, but I think it's more just making sure that whatever transactions occur are done consistently and in a way that promotes confidence in the information you're either providing or receiving. I am concerned about regulatory on the creation of demand, and that's, again, what I think was a shortcoming of the meaningful use funds is that there was demand that was attempted to be regulated, and it just fell short.
So, Mark, in terms of demand and models that can be developed to meet the demand, is payment reform going to drive demand for these technologies, and then it doesn't matter what exactly the technology is as long as the output or the functionality is sufficient to support an integrated system? I mean, is it some version or another of value-based payment? Is it something under MACRA or MIPS? Is it something else that's going to make this useful, worthwhile, desirable from the provider level?
I think that you can look underneath at some of the theories here and say that these forces are inevitable. No matter who is elected in office, no matter who's the Secretary of HHS, this notion of having a more complete view is essential if we're going to essentially assume risk, and we are with the patients, the whole community, a society is, right? So I don't think there's any question about the notion of aggregating data and getting better data to do that. It's all in the details. I tend to be a minimalist, first things first. And I have always been an advocate of doing a few simple things with minimal standards first and do incremental improvement on that. So yes, I think right now, for example, the best way to do the Internet of Things in some patient's home is just have the home health care nurse write down some stuff and write it on a piece of paper and maybe, I don't know, tie it to a rock and throw it through the window of the hospital or something. You don't need to automate something that's very quickly and very much in evolution. And so it's a fool's errand to commit prematurely to certain technologies and very elegant standards, but it's also equally foolish not to pay attention. Let's take one example. We talked about, the phrase was used about getting all the data from a glucometer or some device and getting it to the clinician. Here's the problem. There are 5 or 6 clinicians, maybe 9 clinicians, there might be a dozen different people with 4 different information systems that need to use that. The other thing is they all needed a different level of abstraction. One person might just say their diabetes is tuned up. Somebody else said, oh my gosh, right after 2 hours after a meal, they always have this pattern. So there's a couple principles here. One is somewhere, somehow, somebody ought to keep the original data feed. But then the trick is to present the information to an individual at the level of granularity where it is actionable and meaningful and hide it from the rest else. So that gets to a very simple architectural issue. Are we going to just basically hook a patient's glucometer to all 8 EHRs that somebody has? I don't know about you, but I know how much interfaces to ambulatory EHRs cost, and I don't think so. So we've got to think about an elegant technical solution that allows us to get the data when we need it at the right level of abstraction.
So Dave, are we there yet? Are we close to being there yet? Does the ONC rulemaking process around APIs help in this regard? Are we tackling this the right way?
Well, yeah, I will tell you that, and I'll give you some historical view. I mean, I had, at my previous company, we had about 11,000 customers worldwide, 90% of the Global 2000 doing B2B integration, and we authored many of the standards that were used in those industries. And I think there's a place for both industry-based standards initiatives, and there's a place for regulatory, and I can give you examples of both. And I think to answer the question, there is no silver bullet in any of this, in any industry. And there's different patterns you have to support for the different kinds of processes that you need to do between the entities, whatever those processes might be of sharing information. It could be down to a message level. It could be a notification. It could be a document level like you've seen with CCD and CCDA. It could be an API, a real-time request for something because it's a mobile app or it's some real-time interaction. I think all those patterns will exist. Both and will always exist. You won't see HL7 messages go away, for example. And I think we have to play in that world that interoperability and operationalizing integration between these entities has to be part of our core DNA, just like those other industries do today. They do it, and they all have different internal processes. They all have different kind of EHR systems, if you want to call them that, and they call them something else. But the reality is that they've done a good job of doing exactly what Mark says. They define a process, they define the types of data, the patterns of the message exchange, the patterns of the interfacing, and they go up the stack. They keep adding more and more capability on top of it, which is a combination of both industry-driven and regulatory-driven. Like sometimes the SEC might put pressure on, say, pharmaceutical manufacturing for their stuffing the channel. You need to understand your downstream positions now, which require a different type of interaction, that you need to understand downstream positions of drugs in a supply chain or on the demand side. So again, I think there's no silver bullet for any of this, and I think we keep on advancing the different interaction models and whatever those integration models are, from messaging to documents to APIs, because they'll all have their purposes. And we as a society, as an industry, start implementing process by process to figure out what pattern works best for interoperating and solving some real problems that we have to solve around supporting these new incentives, supporting precise health, and really supporting better outcomes for our patients.
So, Dave, just to be clear, do you see this as varying by institution, by subsector within healthcare? How granular the difference is going to be?
Yeah, I think it could be regional. I think you could see, for example, you might see one state that's heavily dominated by a certain payer, and the payer might actually provide those services on behalf of all the providers, so as a service, and it might be a multi-payer solution. You might see a provider like Vanderbilt that creates that network and kind of offers that service across the entire environment. You'll see all kinds of patterns that will be regional, I think. And I think the folks that figure out how to do this best and include supporting all the incentives that we're going to deal with. Bundled payments is going to drive a bunch of changes for us, as you guys know. It's going to require much more accountability than we've ever had, which I think is good because it will force collaboration between all parties. I think all of those things start changing the requirements of interoperability and integration and operationalizing that as a real business requirement. To date, they haven't been a business requirement, and I think that was Michael's comment. There wasn't enough incentive to say, let's create an HIE and integrate. And Michael and Orion and several of us have been doing this over the years, and we can see value in it, but there wasn't enough business incentive. And I think we're getting to that point with the new incentive models, consumerizations, and really the complexity in servicing precise customers in the future.
David, if I could jump in, I agree with Dave's point on that. I think we are getting close, but as an industry, we're probably not doing a good enough job of celebrating where there are successes and the use of those tools. And I would just point to e-prescribing as something that has been a shining example of interoperability, and albeit typically there are not HIEs involved, but we're not just talking about HIEs and HIOs, we're talking about interoperability and sharing. And so if you look at what drove e-prescribing to be successful, you had industry coming together in the form of the retail pharmacies and the PBMs on the one side. You had the vendor community coming together. The availability of the clinical data in the form of medication history and allergies is a click away. The clinical decision support around drug allergy interactions has been proven over time and is effectively built into the various tools. The efficiency in the workflow for all the stakeholders, whether they be the pharmacists or the providers or the patients, is a much more efficient approach. And there's a business model that works. There's such efficiency gained on the pharmacy side of things that they're willing to provide the revenue model to drive forward utilization around all of this. And look where we are. SureScripts just released an industry report on the adoption rates and utilization of e-prescribing through their gateway. So, I look at what can we learn from that and then apply it to other cases. And even something that should be not a big step away, but even half a step beyond that is opioids. So the entire country, every region, every community is dealing with opioid. And yet, some of the efficiencies that we've gained in how to access controlled prescriptions through PDMPs and have that integrated to a workflow with the appropriate decision support in a way that has those same kind of efficiencies. To me, that's emblematic of what we're dealing with here. We have a proven approach, but we can't seem to expand it quite as far as we need to, even in a related situation.
Well, that's a great example because there's actually systems in place for that, Michael, and we don't leverage them. There's controlled substance ordering systems in every pharmaceutical and every distributor today. We just don't leverage them, primarily because I think business reasons. And I think this gets back into somewhat of the perverse model that we create sometimes in our own industry, if you know what I mean.
United States, 18, 19% of the GDP is on healthcare. The next nearest OECD country is 11%. Where is that 8%? Quality's not as good, frankly, in many metrics. Well, it's in complexity. It's in my view, value-free, unnecessary complexity. And when you have fragmented resources at state levels or smaller, when you have a national solution, it's because somebody's making money off it. And it's just taxes, right? We would not have the tax system we have if computers didn't make it so easy to make it intractable and complex and require a lot of efforts. So one of the things that I think is going to be inevitable is a simplification of some of these things. Maybe it'll start with market consolidation, vendor consolidation, but ultimately some of this simplicity has got to be put back in the system or everybody's going to fail. And then you look at medication histories. I was involved with the creation of Rx Hub and the board of SureScripts and know it pretty well. The interesting thing is, like we said, PDMPs, we're not there. The other thing is we really don't have a medication history for every American with herbals, with over-the-counters, all the medications that count. We have what happens to be in the database, the pharmacies supporting SureScripts, and we still have some fragmentation. I completely agree that we're light years ahead of where I even directly ever could be, but there are huge problems like a portable medication history that remain unsolved despite the enormous sums of money we're putting into these things.
And that's in a subsector that's done a pretty good job, where we've done a pretty good job, right?
Yes.
So we have miles to go before we sleep, I fear, on this on this range. Gentlemen, do you see the opportunity here for a single underlying set of standards that could inform interoperability and its uses, which may manifest themselves in a whole variety of different ways? But do we need some underlying shared infrastructure, like we've been talking about with a handful of national PBMs and payers have this infrastructure in place? Do we need to insist that there be some shared infrastructure in order for the interoperability scheme to really work?
You know, the best shared infrastructure would be EMPI, and Michael will tell you this. I mean, it's a tough issue, but that's the absolute best infrastructure we could deploy in this country, I think. Because if you had a common, index for every patient out there, that creates such a benefit for me from an interoperability perspective long term. That's where the other countries beat us.
You're talking about a unique patient identifier.
Exactly.
Right. Well, we seem to finally be headed in that direction. We have the budget the budget appropriation impediment to that has been lifted apparently. Have you seen movement on that issue in a practical sense?
I haven't, but that would be the best thing that this country could offer, I think, for interoperability. Because we sell into other countries, and one of the advantages we have in those other countries is a unique patient ID. We don't have issues with the continuum of care. We get a full 360 view of the patient. We get all their meds. We get everything. So it's very comprehensive data sets, rich data sets, which gives you an opportunity to do the advanced machine learning, better cognitive support. Right. But this country is very regional by nature, and it's these EMPI tools are probabilistic tools, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I read some of these case studies sometimes. There's hundreds of Mary Sanchez's with the same birth date, a year of birth, receiving services in the same institution over time. Impossible to figure that out.
Well, it's impossible mathematically in a machine. It's pretty easy if you narrow it down to 3 or 4 and you have a human being talking to this Mary Sanchez in question and asking a few questions. That's the beauty of it. If you can solve the case for 95% of the people very reliably, and you can gate these things up or down depending on your risk profile, and then you leave the rest to humans, that's huge progress. But once again, this is a fine example of where the edge cases, if you will, lead to kind of this availability bias that all we can think of is the edge cases, and so we create 1,000 points of no, when actually it's pretty straightforward to build something that would work and let humans muddle around with the rest. It would still be a net gain.
Mark, you're the relentless voice of reason in this conversation. Not suggesting the rest of us are unreasonable, but championing some real-world solutions that don't necessarily require technology to get us much of the way there is an important thing. That sometimes we lose sight of that as an opportunity in solving the problems that we face.
Yeah, and I think Michael will tell you this, that the companies that do the best with sharing of information and creating HIEs, or these new data aggregation services, whatever you want to call them, are the companies that have clear strategies, strong people, and good process. Those are the ones that always succeed over the other entities, and we forget that portion of it. Technology just helps them scale, and I think we should always remember that the organizations that have good people, good strategy, good plan, those are the ones that typically execute, because the technology exists. The technology is so.
And Michael, your business model nails it. I think Michael's nailed it for a certain set of problems. So solutions are possible, absolutely.
So, Michael, how do we drive broader adoption of some of the solutions that already exist, or the infrastructure for solutions that already exist? Is everybody holding their breath waiting for some regs to drop, or not really?
Not really, yeah, I would agree with that. So I think with the work that we are talking about here, we have to align ourselves with some forces that are already underway in this country anyway. If you just look at the value-based care and specifically in the form of a clinically integrated network, or ACO, here part of what we've done in HIE is to try to have the entire universe of practitioners and health systems and labs and pharmacies and community organizations, on and on and on, all participate in the same form, in the same way, sharing the same technology. But yet, some of these organizational forms, like an ACO or CIN, they're self-selected partners who want to do clinical work together in a different way, a more efficient and effective way. So if some of the tools that we've been talking about, and Dave mentioned in the toolbox, are applied at the organizational level, not just an enterprise like a health system or IDN, but at some of these new models that are not necessarily economically integrated, what can we do to leverage these same tools to be able to bring value to an ACO or a clinically integrated network where the incentives are already in place? And then if that's a different starting point for some of this rollout of interoperability and data sharing, then the next level will be, okay, well, how do ACOs share across the ecosystem with other ACOs or other CINs? To me, if 95% of the healthcare is local or within this chosen selection of providers, to me, those tools start making more business sense. I'll add one point with health information exchange that there remains work to be done. When, for lots of good reasons, we all moved from, not all, almost all moved from a clinical data repository centralized model to a federated approach, that was great for all sorts of reasons, from efficiency to data security, et cetera, et cetera. What we sacrificed, though, was the ability to easily do analytics and risk stratification, et cetera, on the data that's accessible through a health information exchange. So while HIE has enormous value on point-of-care decisions, treatment, clinical decisions, and so forth, I think while we can talk about the use of HIE to support value-based care and population health, I think because the data don't typically reside in one place, I think our tool set needs some more work on that front.
Yeah, Michael, and if it's okay, David, I can address some of this. I think HIEs are changing. I don't think they're what they used to be. I think these are becoming more platforms for aggregation, platforms for serving up multiple applications, from consumer apps to population health management to health information exchange to things like precise health. I think you're going to see, and if you look at patterns, Gartner talks about systems of engagement. You're going to see these HIE platforms that look like a system of engagement. So what that means is that it's going to take data from all kinds of systems of records, even social behavioral and omics type systems and biometrics and so forth, and it's going to serve them up to different engagement models that could be clinician focused, payer focused, could be patient focused, consumer focused too, because there's a continuum there. And then it's going to focus on specific applications around chronic care or around population health management or specific analytics into health economics and other types of things you're going to see around these. So I think HIE as we know it, is not going to exist in the next 5 years. It's going to be very different than anything we've seen. It's going to be more of this system of engagement. We have customers that use it the way I just described, or we have customers that do federated, Michael, so they do both patterns that we've seen. And even the federated ones are trying to pull back and say, how do we create this new model. So I think you'll see HIEs very different, more of a system of engagement platform than a traditional exchange of information platform.
Well said.
Well, the vast majority of HIE is a verb. It's not a noun. That's where we got locked in, and David Brailer on through high tech. It had to be a big thing. HIE is a verb, and there's so many ways to send information from point A to point B. That doesn't mean we absolutely need, I would argue, centralized resources for subsegments of population to understand what's going on with the patients at risk in our communities and the like. But the biggest problems I see is, first, people don't even ask the right questions. They run out and they buy something without having an easy explanation. What problem are you trying to solve? Then they don't ask themselves, gee, do I have the right data to solve that problem? If you've got a workflow issue or you've got a readmission issue with the home and all you've got is ICD claims, you're not going to solve it with all the data in the world. So you've got to have the right data. Then you have to have the data organized and coherent so you can believe the stuff. And then you've got to have it in the right platform so that different levels of granularity can go to different people. And that's where the decentralized model breaks down ultimately. Somewhere, even though it may be the primary repository, at some point to solve problems, you've got to bring it all together. And you've got to do something in a centralized place with that thing, and then, if you will, distribute it and control it. So I think the issue of centralized versus decentralized is also, as Dave says, that's going to be another thing that's going to disappear, because as far as I can tell in the cloud, a lot of stuff's decentralized, centralized, call it what you will. I think that term's not going to mean a whole lot to us anymore.
Yeah.
So the value of the availability of data created by a future in which interoperability works wonderfully is what? What is the value of this data? What are we going to be able to use it for? We've spoken a bit about some of these questions, and I'd like to push further in that direction. We've talked a little bit about precision health and what that means. And Dave, I thought you had an interesting take on that. I wonder if you'd speak to that again. Question of precision health and what we need in order to get the most out of that.
Yeah, it's just interesting. It's close to me personally because I have an advantage of Precise Health, a drug specifically designed for his mutation, which actually then changes his traditional therapies or his pathway, if you want to call it, his care plan. Looks different than the other kids with CF because of his outcomes related to it. So that in itself kind of breaks the traditional model of what's the right pathway for, a CF patient, if you know what I mean. But I do think we kind of separate precision health or precise health from population health management. I think they're kind of one and the same because the whole idea about population health management, and I'd be interested in the panel's thoughts on this too, is we're trying to identify a population and identify the chronic patients and the patients that will become ill or will become chronics and try to put them on programs that can stabilize them, improve their outcomes, drive down cost. This is what I don't think we pay well for yet, and we're trying to do it, I think, with some of the MIPS and some of the other initiatives, quality measures, but the will, there's a bunch of us that are pre-diabetic or different states that we have to look at this and how are we reimbursing our healthcare system to deal with the will, because that's the next 5 or 10 years of our cost, and that's where we can actually bend the curve more before the chronics, if you know what I mean. And we don't really have models or incentive models in place. We're trying to get there, I think, with quality measures. But I think for us to separate precise health and population health is a mistake because reality is, as you do an assessment with a group of patients that are chronic care patients, and I'll give you some real live examples, you're probably going to put them on a different care plan for some micro-stratified population of patients. So it's frequent flyers into ED. They might have a set of care plans that look very different than my other chronic patients because they have some social issues that they have to deal with. So I think population zooming down to precise health is what all these systems are going to have to do, and that's going to take, I think, honestly, this new platform that I talked about that's more real-time. It's a system of engagement that's all about real time because it's getting data from everywhere. It's getting ED data, it's getting biometric data, it's getting all kinds of data, social data, and it's going to be driving what does that care plan look like for that micro-stratified group of patients or an individual, like somebody that has no transportation and just calls 911 to get meds, so goes to ED and gets meds and food. And most of that's high volume of our frequent flyers into ED. And that can be handled by a simple different care plan with a care navigator, a nurse, talking to the person, doing mobile logistics, and we take $2,000+ out of the system just like that quick. So I think we as an industry get wrapped around words like precision medicine and assume that omics is going to solve all the problems, and it's not. It's going to be a combination of social, behavioral, omics, and the clinical to get to much more precise care plans for individuals. So going from a population to precise health, I think, are linked, and we have to think about our systems and where are they going to be in the next 5 to 10 years. And I promise you, if you go look at the orphan drug and specialty drug pipeline, it's massive. And if those drugs work like the one drug is working for my son, the care plans deviate drastically. My doctor's asking my son to do tests that he really doesn't need anymore. So we have to look at this totally different than we've ever looked at. And we have to move. We have to kind of blend those, precise health and population health, and being very patient-centered is what we're moving towards, really. And I know that's an old term, but that's what we have to move towards.
Right, I think that's critical, a patient-centered approach. And as you've described it, the precision health and population health are really two sides of the same coin, and they're both together. They're the way in which we are going to be able to manage effectively chronic conditions throughout our system.
And I hope, David, in the long run, we actually figure out models to incent our health system to deal with the will be chronics. Because if we really want to bend the curves long term, it's the will be chronics. Some of the chronics that are down a path, we can try to stabilize them and try to cut the cost. It's the wills. Because if you look at that pyramid, that top 5%, then there's a big percentage underneath that will be chronics. And that's what we really need to focus on. That's education, that's good primary care, that's incenting our doctors to work on quality measures and social and behavioral issues, things that we don't do today. So different incentive models need to come into place to support shifting that long-term cost.
Right. And I think as you started to describe, the social determinants of health cut across both current chronic cases and those who we may see as future chronic cases. And I wonder if Michael could weigh in on this. Do we have the ability, do we have the infrastructure in place from a data perspective to capture the information that we need in order to address social determinants of healthcare within the healthcare system?
I think it's a mixed bag, Dave. Certainly on the hospital side, there is capabilities and access points through the various mechanisms I mentioned before, whether it's eHealth Exchange, Care Equality, Commonwealth, or whatever means necessary. So I think, some big check marks that technically there is access to the data, less so on the ambulatory side. And then you kind of keep going down the list of long-term care, somewhat, behavioral health, a little bit less than that, community-based organizations, a bit less than that. So when you think about, traditional platforms like an EHR to be able to share data, and that's where we're going to have to be more creative in how we engage some of these other organizations that are never going to have an EHR as we think about an EHR, but yet still need to plug into a care delivery system. I just finished up a big stakeholder engagement environmental scan process for a client, and the message was from all of the community organizations, they feel like their faces are pressed against the windows of these large systems of care, saying we can help, but we don't know how. And it's not just don't know how from a technology standpoint, but from a process and business integration contracting standpoint. They they talk different languages, and yet, you know, we can sit on panels like this and say, oh, you know, social determinants of health are going to be key to population health and value-based care in the future. Well, it's not just technology that needs to be solved in that process. We have to figure out what are some human systems and processes that need to wrap around some of the technology solutions as well.
Right, and I've seen this starting to come, this sort of this joining or a blending of purposes and approaches by providers, payers, and pharmacies. I think that each of them now, I see each of them now as seeking to have access to the same kinds of information so that they can each seek to influence behavior outside of the clinic by patients, because all of them are engaged in, to the extent they are, in some markets at least, they're all engaged in a value-based initiative, in a model where there's some financial skin in the game, and there's a desire, therefore, to manage health of individuals and of populations. And again, as you said, each of them speaks a slightly different language. Even maybe the differences aren't as distinct as when you're dealing with more community-based organizations rather than those within the healthcare world, but the same idea is there. I'd invite each of you to ask questions of the rest of the panel. If you have something on your mind, you'd like to take the opportunity to do so.
Could I just reiterate two very important points I think that David and Michael made? The first is, and I think I speak for about my colleagues at Vanderbilt, we aspire, we don't have, but we're further down the road, an integration of real-time care comprehensively and long-term comprehensive data. So we, as David said, do not believe that ultimately you can have one system for real-time care and one system for retrospective care and not have a fusion of those as soon as possible. We also believe in precision medicine the way David has described it with the NIH, in the sense we were one of the largest precision medicine centers in the country. And we've had genetic tests running on our EHRs for over 5 years now. But we are far more, I think, concerned, quite a few of us, of the things that were also mentioned, social determinants. And I would argue, no, we don't have the right data for that. How often do we really know if somebody lives alone, whether their spouse is demented, whether they're poor, whether they can get to the bus? Simple, basic stuff that really drives us. We don't collect the right information. So I, again, say I can do ICD-10 all I want and predict readmission, but if I don't get out to that other stuff and get that information, I'm doomed. But finally, sadly, right now, we have the technical capabilities. I think this thing here, the cell phone, is going to, those things are going to be the game changers. If you have patient portal, put it in a museum. It's just a matter of time. This stuff's going to drive a lot of behavior. But there's no strong evidence that human beings want to change. I'm overweight, and you can urge me, prompt me all I want, and it's not going to affect it. So as we build the technology, we have to hope and pray that people understand the behavioral economics and incentives and social structures enough to actually get people to do stuff that we have with the information, be they recalcitrant physicians, pharmacists, or patients and their families. So we've got a lot ahead of us, and as it's both of everyone said on the panel, it's not all technology.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Dave. Yeah.
I just had an example of one of our customers that exactly what both Michael and Mark said. They put a nurse triage. They got approval from the 911 from a county to put a nurse triage on the 911 line for the frequent flyers, and they reduced their ED visits by 50%. They had 60 patients with over 1,000 visits in a year, 1,000. They reduced that in 1 year, 50%, and primarily it was just doing the assessments, tracking the assessments, putting them on specific care plans, and most of it is they didn't have enough money for the copay for the drug. They needed some food. They needed to talk to somebody, to be honest with you.
Yeah. So, gentlemen, we've got a few minutes left, so I thought I'd ask just a couple higher-level questions of you before we wrap up today's conversation, getting a lot of great comments about what you guys had to say. I've got some medical practices who attended here, and several of them asked about cost. To connect to all the possibilities, we would love to share data and certainly would love to access it, but it's such a big factor cost is, how can the industry make changes so that cost no longer is a factor in the decision making for practices of any size?
Do you want me to start?
I don't think
Anybody?
I'll be happy to provoke for a minute. You can't.
You can't.
Some people are just going to be out of luck in their current environment, probably. Okay, there's several reasons for that. With the slow pace, how things change geographically, and quite frankly, some practices keep trying to do workarounds, and they simply have the wrong EHR vendor. You know, some are much more open to connectivity than others. And this cost of ownership of connectivity, that's something that the Senate Health Committee, the 21st Century Care Act, Senator Alexander, a lot of people have been pounding on, and it's changing behaviors. But I don't know if all the EHR vendors have the wherewithal to find inexpensive mobile connections. And we have to hope and pray that they improve their interfaces enough to make that happen, which they can. But there seem to be a lot of foot dragging here. And I think in many instances it's because the vendors aren't delivering the services that now providers know they need. They didn't need it. They didn't know they needed it back in meaningful use.
So that's, I mean, that's part of the goal of the 21st Century Cures Act and the listening sessions and the regulations that are going to come out of that in terms of certification standards for APIs. The goal is for cheap and simple accessing of information through APIs. We're not there yet, but that's at least on the roadmap.
Well, this is Michael. I'm going to jump in on this one because if the physicians, like the ones who are posing the question, would come in with a strong and clear and powerful voice that is what they want, then the vendor community is not going to solve that problem for them. I think I'm just stuck on this thing about the demand for interoperability and data sharing. If it were there from the customers, then those who are trying to please the customers are going to figure out a way to be able to make that affordable to them. And if not, they're going to lose those customers. By and large, that's just not in place. But it's, as we're all saying, it's growing. We can see it growing. And at some point in our lifetimes, it's going to reach that tipping point where they will be supported.
Yeah, David, I agree. Michael, I agree with that. I think other industries have proven that the customers drive that behavior and the vendors, right? And I think as an industry, we didn't drive it hard enough. We should have been driving all those vendors really hard. They should have been able to connect to everybody out of the box. And that should have been part of the reason you bought them, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
But sadly, high-tech really pushed so many other things on it, it was an afterthought. But there's no excuse for that anymore. That's the point, I think.
Yep.
Okay. Just one more question before we wrap up, and I know we've only got a minute here, but this might take a couple minutes. And you guys touched upon standards, but one of the attendees wanted to know, thank you to the panel for your insight and time. I appreciate the paper and a rock and the dumb it down statements. And I may be dumbing it down too much, but why isn't HL7 being discussed more? Couldn't this be the jumping off point for interoperability?
Lightning round, gentlemen.
I think, I'll take a shot first. I think all three patterns are relevant. HL7, document-based integrations, and also APIs. I think it's always a both and. Look at every other industry. They all went down that same path. Do not discount HL7. It won't go away. It's going to be here for a long period of time, maybe forever, just like EDI never went away from other industries. So it's a both and. You can use HL7 for lots of things, and I will continue to use it.
Other thoughts?
Well said, Dave.
I'll say it another way. HL7 CCDs, every syntactic standard exists. It's like saying I use English as a language. Lord knows we can really mess up communication with English too. The problem is standards are just a good start. Then there's a lot of give and take people have to do to make sure they understand each other when they're communicating. There's by necessity certain wiggle room in those things. So there's a lot of give and take. You can't pull it out of a box once in a while.
Yeah. All right. Well, David, I think that we have to end this conversation, but this has been really fascinating. And to all of you, Michael, Dave, Bennett, Mark, you guys have been great, and we will have to, I'm going to just, obviously re-invite you back when we have our panel discussion next year, because I'm sure there'll be even more to talk about at that point as we continue this dialogue. I want to thank our audience for attending. We will get the recording out to you, and to all of you, really thank you so much for your time today. This was a great conversation.